Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of diplomacy between the world wars. In this case, diplomacy in the 1920s. And we're going to talk in this lecture about a philosophy that has been dubbed kissing diplomacy. The idea that peace could be maintained in this era simply by making promises to avoid conflict and war. We'll see in this lecture how such kissing diplomacy worked out. The conferences and other diplomatic efforts of the 20s attempted to avoid war by making promises to avoid war. The efforts of this period have come to be called kissing diplomacy, a somewhat insulting term for the lack of real depth to the promises that came out of it. The major announcement from this period is the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. In 1927, the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand, invited the United States to issue a joint statement whereby the two nations would outlaw war. The United States Secretary of State was another capable officer, Frank B. Kellogg. Kellogg correctly surmised that the French, in part, hoped to rope the United States into an obligation to help defend France against Germany, if it came to that. This would bear a strong resemblance to an entangling alliance. At the same time, many groups in the United States favored the notion, and it happened at that time that Charles Lindbergh was also making his solo flight from New York to Paris, landing, as we've discussed in previous lectures, to a hero's welcome. So it was a fitting symbol of the two nations coming together in peaceful harmony. So there was some added pressure to make some sort of pact between the nations. To avoid the prospect of an entangling alliance, Kellogg made a counter-proposal to Briand that instead of just the two of them making a promise not to go to war, that they invite all nations to join them. In August of 1928, 15 nations made the agreement not to go to war, and eventually another 62 nations joined them. Cynics called it the Great International Kiss, and some critical scholars in hindsight have dubbed it peace by incantation. Well, what's the problem with promising not to go to war? I guess in essence, one might ask, well, how do you break that promise? You go to war. So while it sounds nice and good, essentially the nations are promising not to go to war unless they do. Scholar Robert E. Farrell blames the international peace movement and an immature and appallingly naive public. Others put the blame on Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes or on Frank B. Kellogg. The scholar Chalmers Vincent sums things up by saying, "Far from coordinating force and diplomacy, the American statesmen and people set the two up as incompatible. The dominant idea was that peace could be maintained, in Vincent's words, by persuasion and example rather than force." So while this act had its critics even at the time, and you can see a political cartoon on the screen reflecting some of the doubts that people had, it's really only with the benefit of hindsight that things are much more clear and how flawed the pact really was. At the time, it wasn't so clear that these efforts would fall apart at the slightest signs of pressure. And in fact, Frank Kellogg was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1929 for his efforts. The other pressing issue of the 1920s was how to handle the tightly linked issues of war debt and the reparations to be paid by Germany. Recall that the Treaty of Versailles in some ways helped to bring about the global Great Depression, which we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. So let's think about how do you pay for a war overall. The United States, for instance, famously in World War II, but also in World War I, issued war bonds. You buy a bond from the government, and the government pays you back in a certain matter of time, 20 years or so, with interest. It is essentially a loan from you to the government. So European nations had done some of that to help pay for World War I, and nations like Britain, France, and Italy all owed money to their own citizens for buying those war bonds. But in the case of World War I, the warring nations had borrowed money from far more than just their own citizens. And in many cases, they had borrowed extensively from American banks and the American government. So collectively, they owed some $10 billion to the United States in the wake of World War I. So the Allied nations owed the United States a lot of money. Now, as we've also talked about previously, by virtue of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany owed the Allied nations their own bunch of money, some $33 billion. Now, theoretically, these are two separate issues. The fact that Germany owed the Allied nations money and the Allied nations owed the United States money don't have to be connected. But it just made too much sense. And as the 20s went on, there actually were agreements that confirmed that the Allied nations would repay the United States insofar as Germany would repay them. The problem was Germany couldn't pay. How could they? They were devastated by war. Many of what would have been their young, productive workers had been killed or maimed, and much of their productive territory and their colonies had been taken away. So the German economy and government was in trouble. What were they to do? Well, Germany began printing money, and huge amounts of it. Their money was hardly worth anything anymore as the 20s went on, and the German Depression of the 1920s was one of the worst on record. In 1914, an American dollar would buy about 4.2 German marks. By 1922, that US dollar would buy about 7,000 German marks. And by 1923, it was almost impossible to calculate. Some estimates have the number at some 4 trillion German marks. This is the depression in which people would go down to the market with wheelbarrows full of money just to buy a loaf of bread. The nation was bankrupt, nobody had any money, and there was no way they were going to repay those war debts. So they began to default on the war debts. Well, what could be done about this? In 1924, the United States tried to solve the problem with the Dawes Plan, named for Charles G. Dawes, a Chicago banker in charge of the committee that came up with the plan. The plan allowed the United States to lend money to European nations so they could begin to pay off their war debt. It also reduced the debt owed by Germany, extended the time they had to pay it, and allowed United States investors to invest some $200 million in Germany, priming their economy so the debt might help to get paid. This is not all that different from the modern process of consolidating debt. If you have a whole bunch of different credit cards and other things, you might be able to go to a bank or some other agency and get them to consolidate things. You make one easy payment, perhaps even the total payment is lowered, and you can extend the time over which you might be able to pay it down. So essentially, the United States, through the Dawes Plan, is consolidating German debt and making it more manageable. Dawes was actually a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925 as a result of these efforts. In 1928, another committee met to finalize plans for German repayment. The chairman of this committee was Owen D. Young, who was the head of General Electric and also a member of the Dawes Committee. This committee set the total of German repayment at about $29 billion to be repaid over 58 years. The Young Plan was ultimately undone by the Great Depression. Within a year or so of the plan being implemented, Germany began to default on its payments again, and other nations, including the United States, struggled to prop up the plan of loan repayment. Ultimately, the arrangements would have to be redrawn again years later. In the meantime, the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, while they eventually fell apart due to the crumbling economy, marked an important return of the United States to the global diplomatic stage. After not joining the League of Nations, These negotiations indicated that the United States was still an active participant in the state of world affairs. So, this cycle of the United States holding up the global economy went under in 1929 with the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. The United States could no longer afford to loan money abroad or invest much abroad. And in fact, many of the companies and businessmen were interested in protecting their American interests and not investing abroad. So Herbert Hoover, as the global depression worsened, encouraged perhaps the single act that made him one of the greatest failures as an American president, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. In 1929 or 1930, one thing that may have slowed the depression or perhaps even prevented it was allowing foreign businesses to sell their goods in the United States. Again, perhaps a cycle would have resulted. Foreign businesses make money by selling to the United States, and with that money, perhaps they can help to pay off their war debts. If they're paying off the war debt, they can ease demands on Germany and perhaps prevent the depression on the whole. But the United States, and particularly Herbert Hoover, didn't see that bigger picture. And as the United States economy struggled, he sought to protect American interests solely. So rather than encourage foreign trade, he tightened restrictions on it. And the way to do that was with the tariff. So just to clarify, what is a tariff? Well, a tariff is a tax on import goods entering the country. It's a way to protect domestic producers and domestic markets against competition from foreign producers who might be able to sell products more cheaply than American producers. So how do you protect the American-made goods? Well, you raise the price artificially on foreign goods by taxing them. In June of 1930, Herbert Hoover signed off on the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, the highest tariff in American history. In other words, it was harder for foreigners to sell their goods in the United States in 1930 than ever before. So those foreign nations who so desperately needed the money to settle their war debt and keep their own economies going could not sell in the one market left that might have provided them with the money. The Depression, of course, worsened, and by 1933, as the new president, FDR, took office, it reached its lowest lows. In the next lecture, we'll look back on these diplomatic efforts of the 1920s and try to summarize how things had gone during that decade.